Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.
Hello everybody, welcome to this Talking Tendons podcast. My name is Peter Maliaris. Today I'm going to be talking about a paper that I am really proud of. It is one, I guess I should say I'm more proud of my PhD student, Iman Mirza, who's completed it. She has worked really hard in difficult circumstances over the last few years completing her PhD, and she's almost at the point of submitting her PhD, and she's been really interested in looking at some of the tissue properties of the Achilles tendon, and this is one of those studies. This study was published recently in the Journal of Experimental Biology. The co-authors are Iman, his first author, Stephen Pearson from the UK, Glenn Lichtwark, and myself. So the title of the paper is The Acute Effects of Higher versus Lower Load Duration and Intensity on the Morphological and the Mechanical Properties of the Healthy Achilles Tendon. And it's a randomized crossover trial. So first of all, let's talk about the rationale for this study. So when we're thinking about the morphological properties, we're thinking about the size of the tendon, so cross-sectional area and volume. When we're thinking about the mechanical properties, generally we're talking about stiffness and modulus, those types of properties. So stiffness being the resistance to length changes for a given force. So the rationale for this study really was born out of this idea that there are fluid shifts that occur within the tendon when it's loaded because it's a poroelastic tissue, and that basically means that you've got a fluid phase, you've got fluid water basically bound by proteoglycans in the tendon, and you've also got lots of collagen, and that's the solid phase. So you've got solid components of the tendon, and then you've got fluid components, and they interact. And part of that interaction explains the viscoelastic properties. So things like creep and stress relaxation, but also load dependency of stiffness. So the faster you load a tendon, the stiffer it is. And they also, some of the properties are also, I guess you could also say it's a poroelastic tissue, which means that basically the fluid is mobile within the tendon, and you can have fluid shifts within the tendon moving to different parts of the tendon. You can also have fluid moving outside of the tendon, and when that happens, they probably explain some of these viscoelastic properties. So we were interested in understanding a little bit more about how shifts in the fluid might occur with different types of loading. And the reason that's of interest is because we still don't really understand the mechanisms for tendon adaptation. We know that heavy load probably leads to tendon adaptation in terms of increased stiffness more than less heavy or less intense loads, but we don't know why. One of the potential reasons is related to fluid shifts. So with heavier load, especially when it's sustained and it's slow, you may get on a biochemical level, changes in the interaction between the fluid and solid phase, which allows some of the water to move, and it might move in terms of redistribution in that tendon, or it might flow out of the tendon. So we think that this happens more with slower loading and sustained load, and probably also happens more with mechanically heavy load or higher intensity loading. So that's exactly what we wanted to test. And the reason we wanted to test this is because if you have more fluid shifts, you're going to have more shear forces. You're also potentially then going to have a reduction in stiffness, which means that you're going to load the cells more ultimately for a given force, and you're going to lead to greater adaptations in the long term. So this is what we were really interested in. So in this crossover trial, Aman recruited a number of patients. I think it was 16 healthy participants, 12 males and 4 females, and she put them through 3 interventions, and then pre and post each of those interventions she looked at the tendon volume as well as tendon stiffness, and it's a really quite an involved process. I definitely recommend read the paper, and it describes the methods, but in effect it's 3D ultrasound where you use an algorithm and you're tracking the ultrasound probe with 3D motion to then be able to reproduce in 3D the Achilles tendon volume, and you do that pre and post. The interventions, the loading interventions, and we also measured stiffness. So stiffness was measured again with ultrasound, looking at strain of the tendon under certain isometric loads. And we did this with not the traditional technique where people track the muscle tendon junction whilst performing isometric loading, but we did this with a technique where we did a sweep, basically a video of the tendon to measure length of the whole tendon whilst they sustained an isometric contraction for 15 to 20 seconds. There are advantages to this technique because one of the limitations of tracking muscle tendon junction is you can't be sure that you're always tracking the same point, and there's error related to that. So table 1 in Aman's paper shows the time to peak, which was the same, 1 second time to peak, but the MVC was different, 75% in 2 groups and 35% in the low intensity group. And then of the 2 groups that did 75% MVC, one had an 8-second contraction time and the other one had a 2-second contraction time. So what we were modulating is contraction time and intensity. What we found, so again, it was a crossover trial, so every person did each of the interventions and there was enough time for washout of any change in volume. So we were really interested in acute changes in volume, and if we in volume and stiffness, and this is the first step. The next step is going to be looking at prospective. So the idea was to get the group that produces the most mechanical fluid shift based on volume measures, and then implement that over a prospective trial to see whether that impacts on adaptation, which is the plan now. So what did we find? What did Aman find? Well, we found that the intervention with the highest mechanical loading, i.e. the one with the 8-second contraction time for 75% MVC, led to the greatest reduction in free tendon volume. Okay, free Achilles tendon volume. So we measured the Achilles tendon volume, and the volume reduced substantially in that group, more so than in the other 2 groups. We also had a reduction in stiffness, more so in that group than the other 2 groups. So predictably, we saw reductions in stiffness because the fluid goes out of the tendon, and we also saw reductions in volume, so fluid going out of the tendon. So these could be, if you do this repeatedly over a number of weeks, you're probably going to see what we think you're going to see is more adaptation related to those changes, mechanical changes in the tendon. So really interesting, a starting point for going on to then test this hypothesis that we have that these changes might be associated with adaptation. So interesting to see this, and as I say, really happy to see this paper come out in the Journal of Experimental Biology for Aman and Aman's PhD. So really nice paper if you want to get your head around some biomechanics of the tendon and adaptation of the tendon. That's probably one to put on your reading list. And there's lots of nice diagrams and explanations of all the stuff. Probably Aman does a better job in explaining it than what I do, so please read the paper as well. I will link it to this podcast I hope you enjoyed that, and I will see you next time.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.